Massachusetts. The station is in Memphis, Tennessee. We're joined by Josh Preville, who is the creator of a new documentary film, Losing God. Josh, thanks for joining me this afternoon. Are you there, Josh?
Can you hear me, Chuck?
All right, we're having a little... Yep, I sure do. Thanks for joining me. There we go.
All right, well, thanks for having me back on.
Today. I think that it's my I have like a home studio here in Boston, and I think that there's some technical problems today. Probably the NSA is getting after me. I don't know. Anyway, talk a little bit, Josh, about your movie and how it is that you became an atheist.
Sure. I guess it happened over like about a 2-year period. I was a Pentecostal Christian for most of my life, and I reached a point where I started thinking for myself and questioning a lot of my beliefs that before I had just gone along with, and I fully believed them, don't get me wrong here, but there was a point where I realized I hadn't really been questioning it with full skepticism. I had skepticism in other areas of my life as a performing mentalist, and I followed many big-name skeptics and other performers in the field. And then I found out one day that one of them was an atheist, and I said, how could you be an atheist? He's so intelligent. It made no sense. And then I started researching, and basically once I started... By
the way, that's a great question. If I could just interject here, I think that's a great question. Sure. Anyway, go on.
What's that?
I think that's a great question. How could you be an atheist? You're so intelligent. Anyway, I'm just kidding. Go on.
I gotcha. So, yeah, basically I started questioning, and over about a 2-year period, I started realizing so many of these arguments made sense that I actually started losing my belief. And to those who have ever converted or deconverted from one faith to another, you can understand that once you hit a certain point, and the line I use is, once you stop believing that donkeys can talk, it's kind of hard to go back. I mean, there's a Bible story about a donkey talking. But, yeah, that's basically the short version of my deconversion. And I actually ended up making a documentary about this where I wrote a short letter to family and friends kind of explaining it. Because, I mean, everybody up to that point that I knew was everybody was religious. There was no atheists in my life. Anything like that, even agnostics or, along those lines. So my movie is divided up. It started with my letter, but then I found other members of the Christian faith. We have a Christian comedian. We have a retired Christian psychotherapist. We have an 84-year-old pastor who is still pastoring to this day, a Christian biker, a street preacher. And we talked to all these people about things that my letter kind of focuses on, different aspects of the Christian faith. Mental illness, would you kill your child for God? These big name kind of issues that are in society today. And in the film, we divide up my letter with interviews with these folks, basically sharing their beliefs on these issues. And we even put in some statistics about what the rest of America feels in the same way.
Josh, when you say that you came to believe that donkeys can't talk, because obviously you're talking about the story of Bilam and Bilak in the Bible.
Right.
I think that in the broad sense, what you're saying here, and you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, is that you don't believe in any sort of a supernatural. You think everything can be explained by what you can see, hear, smell, and touch. In other words, that it's a natural world, it's a natural universe, it's kind of a closed world, that nothing other than that which we as human beings can perceive is real. In a sense, in the broad sense, when one operates on that line of reasoning, which is the materialist view, one also would deny the existence of a soul. They would deny the existence of the source of reason. In a sense, we just assume it happens. You're denying, in other words, it's a natural versus a broader supernatural view. So would you say that you do not believe in anything but the physical, natural world? In other words, that human beings are nothing more than this bag of bones and blood, that we're nothing more than evolving animals that evolve through breeding, which is, of course, is Darwin's theory. and I'm not saying I'm not subscribing you to that theory, but I mean, do you get what I'm saying? Do you subscribe to that natural view? Okay,
sure.
so then, therefore, there's nothing miraculous about life. There's nothing in terms of, when you wake up in the morning and you open your eyes to the world, everything can be explained by matter. There's nothing, there's no spirit there. There's nothing that can't be physically explained by observation.
Sure. Well, just for starters, the idea that there's nothing miraculous about the world, whether or not it came from a god, I disagree with. A while back, there was a video that went viral. There was the woman who swam across, I can't remember exactly where, but one of the oceans or something. She swam a huge distance and went on Oprah Winfrey to talk about it, right? And this went viral because Oprah was asking her if she believed in a God or not. And this woman said, no, I don't believe in God. But she made a great statement. She said, I'm an atheist who's in awe, right? So Oprah says you can't be in awe of the universe or the wonder of life or anything if you're an atheist, unless you believe in a God. I disagree with that. But when it gets to the original question of is it more of a naturalist viewpoint on life, I guess you could say, I think most of what we know today it still needs to be improved upon, right? I mean, that's what makes science so awesome, that we can think something is true, we can back it up with the best evidence we have, and then down the road, as better evidence comes along and disproves that, we can use that evidence, and we'll get better as time goes on. So, yeah, I think the evidence regarding things like a soul or whatever, we don't really have evidence for that. And a lot of people say, well, if it is supernatural, there won't be any natural evidence. Well, I guess that's the problem then with a supernatural belief system. What evidence do we have? If we're really trying to ground it in science and in the scientific method, what evidence can we turn to support that idea or that theory, if you will? So yeah, I would say for the most part, yeah, you'd be right on that.
Just to answer the question, I think that, and of course this is my opinion, I think it was none other than Thomas Jefferson who said it best in the Declaration of Independence, which is that it is self-evident. And by the way, I agree with you in that I don't agree with Oprah in that one cannot take in the awesome nature of the universe. I think you can. But but you're kind of begging the question there, nevertheless, which is this universe that has an awesome nature that we don't understand aspects of, do you believe that it is a naturalist universe, or do you think that there is a supernatural element? In other words, can everything, regardless of how awesome, regardless of the fact that we haven't discovered everything or identified everything, is it just simply something that exists as matter? Or is there some sort of a supernatural aspect, what Aristotle called the primus mobile? In other words, is there a prime mover? Is there a point in time or in space where things were created by something other than just it just exists as a physical mass?
Right. Well, I think the evidence that we have today would say that there is, as you would say, you'd probably disagree with this, there's no supernatural element that we have any evidence for. And that's, especially if you go down the route, which we talk about a little bit in the film, regarding, creation versus evolution. I don't really get into that type of discussion because, number one, I don't know a whole lot about that. That doesn't concern me because my argument is I don't know a lot, and that's okay. It's okay not to know something. But what tends to happen when it comes to the supernatural is when someone doesn't know something, they tend to say, well, I'll just accept it on faith. So I'll accept the fact that there is a prime mover on faith instead of going, let's find out what actually happened. Let's look at the evidence and try to come up with the solution. Does that make sense?
Sure. And I think that, as Jefferson said, it's self-evident, that there's not that we're not just an inanimate bag of matter that simply moves through the world and that breeds in order to create superior races, which was Darwin's theory. It was a racist theory. And then
I think you're talking about social Darwinism there, which is a little different. But anyways, go ahead, Jack.
No, it's the same. It's the practice of social Darwinism as believed in by Darwin and by his son, who was the head of the eugenics department at the at London School. It's the practice of Darwinism. In other words, if you take the idea that man is nothing more than an animal that breeds in order to create a superior species, or any species for that matter, then the practical result, the practice of that would be to create a superior species through breeding. That's what the theory that was embraced in the biological sense by the Nazis, but also in the philosophical and social sense by Karl Marx, who dedicated his book Das Kapital to Darwin, and who credited Darwin with helping him found his theory, where he had societies evolve until they had reached the perfect society, which he called communism. But putting that aside, the idea at its core is that man is nothing more than just, a bag of matter. And I would suggest to you that science and logic and observation is actually not on that side. I mean, it just seems, as Jefferson said, self-evident that there is something more going on in life than simply inanimate objects moving around like pieces of cordwood and breeding with each other, that there is some greater purpose, greater function. Now, in Western society, we call it God. In other societies, they have other names for it. But it doesn't matter, really. The point is that the principle is that there is something bigger, there's a greater meaning, and that this something not only is a creator of the universe, however that came about, and that's a mystery, but it also is the source of a moral code that is inherent. It's not something that just happened. You know what I mean? It's the ideas that for example, this country was founded on, which is were based upon the biblical moral code of Sinai. In other words, the reason why we understand that killing is wrong, thou shalt not kill, is from Sinai. That was what the Torah told us. Anyway, so your thoughts.
Sure. Well, just regarding Darwin real quick, we don't have to get stuck in that, but the idea of, as you mentioned, like survival of the fittest and stuff like that, Darwin basically gave an analysis of what he sees, right, currently in nature, what happens. So the argument that it should be that way and we should, have a superior race, that doesn't necessarily stem from that. That's just what he observes, and then other people, and you're saying maybe even his son or whoever, I'm not familiar with that, but let's say they even went with that. The idea that it does exist doesn't make it something we should follow. It just happens to exist. But we don't have to get stuck in that.
Right.
When it comes to...
No, I think you're right. It's well, we're going to take a break here, but yes,
sure.
He identified this. Our claims is Josh Preville. The website is joshpreville.com. And Josh is a filmmaker, author, mentalist. He is he's created a new documentary called Losing God, which is available on his website. Josh, we don't want to get too bogged down into a talk about Darwin. I just would point out that the process of science, and I kind of agree with you here with regard to what he did, is that the science will identify something that's true and reality. I would argue it's an identification of God's world, but that's another subject. And then it's applied. In other words, when in chemistry we identify and isolate a drug that can help cure a disease, we then use the drug to cure the disease, or we apply it. It's it becomes an applied science. So Darwin's theory, which was never proven, recognized or claimed or was theorized that man would and species would evolve through breeding, and eventually out would pop a superior species. And the application of that theory, assuming that was true, was called eugenics. I mean, it was this idea that therefore, since we want to breed superior species or superior human beings who would be healthier and stronger and more intelligent, we would engage in a deliberate and conscious process of breeding people and getting rid of people who we think are not well bred because, after all, they're taking up space and the world has limited resources, and that ultimately, eventually, out will pop a new species, a superior species, what the Nazis called the Übermensch, and that this theory was adapted by Marx to become a social theory, which is that mankind would evolve through different stages of society: feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and eventually the ultimate goal, utopian, would be communism, where the entire planet would become a massive ant colony, and that everyone would be actually equal, de facto equal, and that all the things that make us unequal would disappear, would vanish. And one of those things, by the way, was believe in God. Anyway, Josh, but I think that getting back to our topic here, you're a naturalist. You think that everything can be explained by what you can see. There's no supernatural element. There's no soul. Let me ask you this. I mean, I know it's kind of a simplistic question, but if you tell me that there's no soul, how do you explain Aretha Franklin?
Well, just to address on that Darwinism thing, sure, some people took what he said and said, let's apply it. That does not mean that you should, though. That does not mean it's a good thing. That does not mean that it means atheists do that, etc. Just to make that clear.
No, I agree. I mean, you should, and I don't think you should. By the way, I'm totally with you on that.
Right.
Okay.
Regarding the soul, I would just ask what evidence we have for the soul.
Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul. Where do you think that came from? Do you think are you going to tell me she's just a good singer? I mean, there is something more going on there that makes that happen. I mean, does she have a better throat than someone else? I mean, is everything just physical? Is it just air breathing through a larynx? There's something more. I would argue, we'll let our listeners decide otherwise. There's something more going on with that. There is a soul. That's why they call her the Queen of Soul. I mean, music. Well, I mean, where did this? Mozart or Beethoven. They put a bunch of little marks on a page to create a symphony, but yet there's something bigger going on when that happens. When you hear that, when you listen to something, or when you experience something that's an abstract expression, I would argue, of soul or something greater like art or the arts, you are connecting with something that is more than just physical existence. It's obvious. Well, I mean, I think that, again, Jefferson, not to repeat myself, said it's self-evident that we are endowed by a creator. Anyway.
Yeah, I think you've taken something, right, that's an experience for you or for someone else that is a result of neurons firing in your brain that you are now citing to a higher being. And the only evidence you've provided to that soul or that supernatural element is that experience, right? So you asked if it's something is it just her throat? Is it this? Is it that? For some people, right, you can look at them and you can literally scan someone's brain, right? So we can see that creativity stems from certain areas of the brain, and certain talents or gifts or whatever you'd like to call them are a result of your brain. Now, let's make the argument in your favor for a second. Let's say, you know what, we can't predict anything. Let's say we have no knowledge of any creativity in the brain or anything. All we've come up with is, I can't explain how they sing this way or how they affect me in this way, so it must be insert the blank here.
All right, Josh, we got to take another break. We got to take another break. We'll be right back, Josh. Hold on.
Sure.
And studying science to suggest that this idea that music and that the reaction of music can be explained by neurons firing in the brain, that's really faulty science. I've never seen a scientist who has any legitimacy come up and suggest that. There's certainly no proof of that. There's very little. I mean, if you talk to scientists who study the brain, they will tell you that there is still very little known about it, and where there is a sense, there is actually a theory that the brain is the source of reason, but there's no proof of that either. I mean, so I think that if you're going to make sweeping statements and claim they're scientific, that's okay, but I think it should be put in the context that this is opinion, and that if you can cite someone to back it up, that would be great, but I would suggest that if you did, you would find out that they would not either say this or that they would point out that it's a theory. So I just want to make that little disclaimer there.
Sure. Well, when I say that, I don't know if, and your listeners can go back, I'm sure, and listen to the podcast, but I'm not making a claim that the reason that Aretha Franklin is such a wonderful singer is because of neurons firing. I was giving an example of how sometimes things come down to little actions in the brain, so a neuron firing. So a receptor, whatever you want to come down to.
Yeah, there's no proof that has anything to do with it.
There is a small, minute fraction of brain activity going on that creates a larger effect. So every thought that we have right now is a result of a neuron in some area firing off at the synapses, right? So
yeah,
I'm
but
not
what does
making
that
a claim
mean?
that scientists
all that
say
means,
Aretha
all
Franklin
that,
is great.
Yeah, but wait a minute, Josh. All that means is that our brains and our other organs function and respond, that we're alive. It doesn't. In other words, to assign that some meaning that would therefore explain what it is that makes Aretha Franklin's music, and again, we're using her as an example. We could use others.
Right.
I mean, have the reaction it is. That's pretty faulty. I mean, of course, the brain has neurons firing every time you go to the toilet. I mean, there's nothing.
Right.
There's no. You're putting a certain suggestion of judgment on what that means, and that's not something that science does. It just observes the fact that it happens. There's nothing beyond that. And again, people who study the brain will tell you, and these are the best scientists, that there's still very little known about it. Nobody knows what that means.
I agree with you. I'm not
why
making
some
any
people
absolute claims
okay.
about the creation of those thoughts or the effect of them. I'm just saying, I think the context of what we were saying when this came up was, it's the soul. And I said, well, I think things boil down to little actions that create a larger whole. You've said it's the soul, and the only reason that it's the soul in your example you gave was, well, she's amazing, and I can't explain it. So I'm saying, well, we can explain, for example, a thought, or like you said, you can sit on the toilet and you're thinking, right? Some people 10 years ago said, how do you know how to go on the toilet? You have no clue. So my only point here was not that I'm this amazing scientist making this claim about how Aretha Franklin is amazing. I'm saying you came up with an example of, listen, I can't explain how good she is besides a soul. And then Josh comes back and says, well, I think there's more to it than just, let's just blame it on the soul. Let's look at why we have thoughts, why we have a feeling when we hear music. Some people aren't affected by music in the way that you and I might be affected by music. So why is that? Is their brain chemistry different? Science is about asking questions and trying to figure out the answer, not just going, it must be the soul because Jefferson said it's the soul. Does that make sense?
Well, the fact is that science doesn't have the answer to this. Everyone is affected at some level by music, and that the reason Aretha Franklin does what she does also is because she's worked at it. I mean, it's no question that there are earthly, natural reasons why she's been. By the way, she came from church. She started singing because she was inspired by something bigger. But putting that aside, that's part of it. Anyway, we'll be right back. So, I think that the answer to that question, I mean, and people need to understand the context before they answer such a question. First of all, you should study as a Jew. Speaking as a Jew here, you need to study the Talmud, and you need to study the rabbis, and you also need to understand the Torah in Hebrew, not in English, because the English translation is not accurate. It basically, what it did was it isolated it into simple meanings. It took out some of the nuance. But having said that, I would point out that, number one, I'm interested in what man is doing to other men and women. That's something that I can't control, but at least I can have some influence over. I can't control or influence or understand what God does. I mean, that's just how it is. To understand why God did this, again, I would refer to the rabbis of the Talmud. But to suggest that God is coming to somebody today and telling them to kill somebody, I would say that if that happens, and this is for our listeners here, number one, you should see a psychiatrist because you're hearing voices, right? I mean, you're hearing voices, and what you think might be God, you need to get help. You need medical help. And secondly, I would suggest you see a pastor, whether it be a rabbi or a minister, and say, I think I'm hearing voices, and I think it's God talking to me, telling me to murder somebody. How can I know what this is? In other words, a person that has is not insane and that has a shred of rationality and reason would take the necessary steps to try to find out what's going on, to see, is this really God, or am I a schizophrenic, or am I hallucinating? And if they do that, then they're going to discover that they're hallucinating. That this is it comes from a psychological problem. Questions that would cause them, or maybe it caused him at one point, to question his faith in God. And in this case, we're talking about his calling people, would you kill your child if God told you to do it? I've told you what I think about that. I mean, I think that you need to see a psychiatrist. But the bigger question, Josh, I think, is that I'm concerned with what we can do as people on Earth to deal with other people who are killing people. I can't worry about what God does or doesn't do, but I can worry about what sort of society can exist that would discourage other people from killing others and taking the place of God by deciding who lives and who dies, but have no right to do so because they're not God, they're humans. I can also be concerned with political philosophies that encourage killing other people. I mean, I point to historic examples like Lenin, the founder of the socialist experiment in Russia, who ordered the murders of millions of people because they were not politically correct. Literally sent out his Cheka to kill people by the hundreds of thousands, eventually millions. I could point to Hitler, did the same thing. That's what worries me as a human being. Not whether God is going to tell anybody to kill someone. It's whether people are being told to kill other people for various reasons. It's from people who are trying to replace God with men. What say you?
Well, I think from my end, if there was a God who was telling people to kill people, I would be equally concerned with that God as I would be with other humans who are killing people. But I get your logic that, if it really is a God who's doing this, we can't control that God. So
that's right.
When you make comparisons to people on Earth, I think this gets into the idea of morality, right, and how we can create laws. And you brought up earlier that our legal system is based on the Ten Commandments. Well, some of the Ten Commandments are good. That's awesome. Don't steal. We don't want you to kill people. But I think the argument that we need the Ten Commandments to know right from wrong is not, to me, is not based on any kind of logic. Just because, well, I guess it depends where you go with that. I mean, if you think atheists I've talked to people who said that if they became an atheist, they would just start going out and being immoral and killing people. They've actually told me this, Chuck. And I said, well, I'm glad that you stay religious then, if you don't have that control of your actions. You know what I'm saying? So I guess it depends on what you're really trying to say when it comes to the laws of a country or a ruling society. Because I think you're right. I think we do need to hold people accountable, but it's on what standard, I think, is the point you're making.
Well, yeah, and first of all, God isn't telling anybody to kill anybody. I mean, in the Torah, there are specific cases at specific times with specific people where God told Moses and he told the children of Israel to annihilate certain people. But those are people who don't exist anymore. And there were reasons why that happened. It wasn't something that Moses wanted to do. The rabbis explain it. It's really something that is held up to mankind as an example for what not to do, and that ultimately you're going to die for doing this, not on earth, but in your soul. And that God is not calling anybody to be killed today. This is one of the problems, quite frankly, that Islam has. They think that they're being commanded to kill people who are infidels because they think God is telling them to do that. I'm operating here from the Judeo-Christian perspective. I mean, I believe in the Torah, which, by the way, Islam does too, and I think that they've forgotten that because they also hold the Torah up as divine. And I think we should remind Muslims that that's part of their faith also. And as far as the Ten Commandments, it's not just the Ten Commandments. The idea of thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, it is the Ten Commandments. And the entire Decalogue is the basis, and this is a fact of history, not only of Western civilization, but of our founding of this republic. The founding fathers looked to the Bible when they decided and crafted the sort of government we would have. And they did so in the most fundamental aspect of it, and the one thing that I think made the United States the most religious country in history is that Jefferson in particular, but they all got this idea that rights come from the Creator, not from the state, not from man. In other words, we don't make up laws because we find them convenient. We'll make up laws like Lenin made up laws. Oh, well, we'll kill the kulaks. We feel that law is something that is outside of man's ability to create. It's something that is beyond human manipulation. And that's the very idea that this country is founded on. Jefferson said it in the Declaration of Independence. We're endowed by the Creator with rights, standing basic morality. But I also would suggest that in our own times, the societies that have turned their back on God, and the societies have been atheist, which are both the communist and the Nazi movements, they were not respective of these principles. They believed that they had a right as elites who were enlightened somehow to make laws, and those laws could include eliminating people that were standing in the way of their idea of progress or evolution. And I think that the idea that laws come from outside of man's manipulation is something that I would argue is self-evident. I would argue that it didn't just come out of nowhere. I mean, it would be natural for people to kill each other, wouldn't it? It would be natural to steal, right? I mean, there's nothing in nature that would say don't do that.
If we look at, you said a few things. The first thing you were talking about is societies that are atheists, and we touched upon this on my first interview on your show, so I won't get bogged in it. But basically, a society that is atheist, quote unquote, all the word atheist is, it's a word to signify a lack of belief in a God. So atheist. I mean, if you don't believe in aliens, you'd be an a-Martianist, right? You don't believe in them. It just addresses belief. So if someone says, I'm an atheist and I also do this, right, fill in the blank, that now fulfills a new thing. There's no tenets of atheism. You just don't believe in a God. So when societies take that on and then, go down a different road, I don't think we should stereotype that word. So just like if someone were, the other day I just read an article about somebody who killed their children and they were Christian. That does not mean that Christians want to kill their children. That means we have a person who did and said that it was because of Christianity. We shouldn't stereotype Christians, and we shouldn't stereotype atheists or the titles they hold. When it comes to the society and how we rule and where laws come from, I would disagree. I think people have an idea. If you think back to tribal days, I mean, now in America we're not so much tribal, but other countries.
Right, we'll be back. We got to take one.
Up on Ziploc for delicious holiday leftovers. The new containers with one press seal.
He's got a movie up there, also on YouTube. That's a documentary of his story of losing God. Josh, we were talking earlier, and I just want to respond quickly. There's nothing whatsoever in Christianity that told anybody to kill anybody. The woman who murdered her children, she didn't do it. She may have been a Christian that claimed to be in name, but there's nothing that instructed her to do that. The same can't be said about man-made political movements, as I've pointed out. I don't mean to sound like a broken record here, but Nazism and communism, both atheistic movements, they do call for killing people. They call for killing a lot of people. So she was insane, or she was just, if she was embracing some kind of an ideology, it certainly was nothing in Christianity that told her to kill anybody. There's nothing that, authorized her to go out and kill her children. That's just a fact. Now, as far as the origin of go ahead.
I was just going to address a few things there. First of all, I'm going to have to be repeating myself on this. When it comes to an atheist movement, right, all the word atheist means is lack of belief in God, someone who does not believe in a God. Now, if an atheist does something, that's on their own business. But you can't say that, well, you can say whatever you want, but it is not grounded in the actual definition of atheism. Break it apart. theism, belief in God, not or no belief in a God. Put them together. So no belief in a God or lack of belief in a God does not automatically jump over to let's kill people. Now, there were some people who said, oh, I'm an atheist, or oh, I'm this, and I do this. And the example I brought in of that woman was to show, she says she's a Christian, she killed her child, thinks that God wanted her to do that. That is not representative of all Christians in the same way that an atheist killing someone is not representative of atheists. There is no, a movement of atheism would only be, by definition, a movement of no belief in a God or lack in a belief of God. So when we make that claim, we're inserting things that don't belong there because we're now generalizing one person's view that they think fit in a certain way to a whole population, which is not true. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I actually agree with you technically I agree with you in that atheism basically believes in nothing. They don't believe in any supernatural. It's like a non-belief. They exist in a sense as a negative. We are non-believers. We don't believe, in this case, in God. So therefore, you can't ascribe things to them since they're saying, we don't believe in God. We may have other beliefs, but it doesn't include belief in God. I would point out to you, however, Josh, that the sum effect of it, and this does not apply to everybody who's an atheist, because probably, at least in this country, most people who are atheists have embraced what I would argue is the Judeo-Christian moral code. But the idea in its sum is that if you don't believe in anything, then there's a vacuum, and that vacuum, if it's embraced by a lot of people, is going to be filled by something. I think it was G.K. Chesterton, the British Christian thinker of the early 19th century, who made this point. He wrote about it extensively, whereas he said if you don't believe in anything, you're going to eventually believe in everything. And that in that vacuum then comes other beliefs eventually. And again, I don't mean to generalize here because it's not true with everyone who's an atheist. It's probably not true with you, I don't think. But if you have an ideology that suggests that you should turn your back on God and believe in the state, or believe in the Führer, or believe in the king, or believe in whoever, then people naturally seem to look toward it. There's something about the human makeup that we look to something to believe in, and if it's not going to be God, it's going to be Hitler. It's going to be the state.
So I'll interject
now again, I know I'm general. I don't mean to generalize here. I'm not saying saying that that's true across the board. I'm saying that it is a vacuum of belief. It is a non-belief, but human beings believe. So therefore, the question comes down to, what are you going to believe? Are you going to believe in a supernatural God, or are you going to believe in a man-made, earth-bound set of ideologies that serve someone else's interests?
Right. So when we look at, first of all, what you said about atheism is only a lack of belief in a God. So it's not, when you said they don't believe in anything, you can believe in all kinds of things, but atheism just addresses a deity, right? So I would plot, and I don't know exactly where you fall on this, but most Christians that I've spoken with, right, you say, oh, do you believe in Allah? And they say, no, I believe in, Jesus Christ, God the Father, the Trinity, right, the biblical Judeo-Christian God. So if they believe in one God or if you don't believe in Thor or Zeus or, insert whatever God through time people have worshipped here, if they don't believe in one God, I also don't believe in that God. I just go one God further, right? That's like the simplest way to put it. I just go one God further. So you already, and I can't speak for you, Chuck, but many people I've spoken with already don't believe in a bunch of different gods. They select one that they're going to believe in, right? And the rest are written off. So atheists just go one God further, and they don't believe in any of them. I mean, you can be an atheist and believe in aliens if you want. Atheism is just a lack of belief in a deity. But when it comes to, society and jumping now into other beliefs, the argument could be made in reverse that once you believe in Jesus Christ, you could believe in other things. When we look at it on the whole, we have to be careful that we're not making generalizations, even if we don't want to, because in a sense we are saying if you don't believe in God, then you'll love the state, or, whatever statement you were making. I know I'm not getting you right here, but I think we're making a jump that doesn't really follow logically along those lines. It's like if I said, well, if you believe in God, you must believe in the tooth fairy. That's not true. You know what I'm saying?
Well, what I'm saying is that if you don't believe in a supernatural, however that happens, you're going to believe in a man-made entity, something that is going to command you to do things. In other words, I guess that it goes down to, again, the ideas that created the founding of the American Republic, which is something I actually have studied. And that is that we believe that rights come from outside of human manipulation. In the case of the West, it's God. That's what we call it, and the Judeo-Christian moral code. And if you don't believe that it's outside of human manipulation, then you're going to be manipulated ultimately by human ideas, and that those ideas are not rooted in an objective understanding of morality. They're objective.
Okay,
they're rooted in yourself in interests.
Right. So that's interesting. I don't quite know where you fall. I know you said that you're Jewish. If I look at the faith I came from, right, Pentecostal Christianity, former born-again Christian, right? If you look at the moral system that we're talking about, sure, you can take out some good things from the Ten Commandments. Not, we don't have to get into Ten Commandments, but, you can talk about why is it immoral to make an idol? What does that have to do with morality? That seems to be a personal religious view. But regardless, let's go with, okay, some of these murder things and stealing, that stuff's good, right? But according to my former faith that I came from, and again, we briefly touch on this in Losing God. People can get it now. It's at losinggodmovie.com or Josh Preville, whichever is easy to remember. In the movie and in my life, I get in this discussion a lot. When you look at faith and belief and what makes things moral and immoral, I don't know if you believe this, you'll have to let me know, but where I came from, if somebody killed somebody, they can still go to heaven just off belief in God. It has nothing to do with their actions or their punishment for their actions, right? So on earth here, if you kill somebody, you're going to be held accountable. In heaven, if you believe the way that most folks in sort of Protestant, I guess, Christianity would fall, if you say, Jesus, I'm sorry that I killed somebody, I believe in you, you'll go to heaven and be rewarded eternally, versus someone who may have been feeding the homeless every day, but if they didn't believe in Jesus, they didn't have a belief in God, they're going to be tortured forever. Now, if that's a moral standard, I'd question that 100%.
Well, so do I. I mean, I'm not Christian.
Right.
That's a Christian theological matter. I think it's a belief that, I mean, it's harmless. They're not flying airplanes into buildings.
Right.
The important thing to me is that the Christian has accepted the moral and ethical code of Sinai. They've accepted the Decalogue, and that's a debate that's existed within Christianity, whether it's a religion of sheer faith or whether it's a religion of works. Judaism is a religion of works and faith, as is Catholicism, as are most Protestant groups. Now, you're talking about one that says, okay, I can go out and murder people, but if I believe in Jesus, I'm forgiven. I mean, that to me is a theological question. I don't get that either.
Right. So I guess I would ask, why do you think you need the Ten Commandments to be moral?
Well, you don't need it, but the fact is that because I believe that it exists, I believe that it is an objective foundation of morality. It's not something that, I mean, I would rather look to something outside of myself as a moral standard than not do that, than think I can just be the source of morality myself. I can make it up. Doesn't matter what I think. If I say it's moral, it's moral. I could be Jeffrey Dahmer carving up boys and putting their bodies in the freezer. What right do you have to tell me that's immoral? If I say it's moral, and if you say it's not, if you're telling me it's not, then you're discriminating against me. In other words, what it does is it creates an objective body of moral and ethical code that I can live by. and that I can point to that's outside of human manipulation. That's the key there.
Right. So the problem with that, in my opinion, and again, this is only my opinion, if we look at the Ten Commandments, we say that's what we're basing our morality on. Again, sticking with the Old Testament, I mean, slavery, that's not even addressed in the Ten Commandments. Slavery was A-okay in the Old Testament. So if we only look at the Ten Commandments, we're going to miss out on things that at least I would consider slavery immoral. I would hope you would too, and I assume that you do. But that's something that you think would be mentioned over having no other God. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, let me respond to that. Firstly, the Torah began the process of abolishing slavery. It recognizes that slavery existed in human society, but the slavery of the Torah was not the same thing as the slavery in the Western Hemisphere, in the American South. The slave in the Torah, it actually, don't forget, this was at a time before capitalism, when you didn't have free trade of goods and services. You didn't have a development of private ownership. And the slave was treated as a family member. They got, to rest on the Sabbath, and they were required to.
Chuck Morse speaks.
Thank you very much. Josh Preville's my guest. Preville, sorry, Josh. The website is joshpreville.com. The movie is Losing God. Josh, just to finish up regarding slavery, the Torah puts in place the beginnings of what would become labor law. It was forbidden for the Israelites to abuse their slaves. I mean, this is, in its time and in the context of the times, it was quite progressive. I mean, it began mankind on the path toward recognizing the sovereignty of the individual at a time before, as I said, capitalism had been developed. Now, in modern times, we've seen man who's turned his back on the Bible bring back slavery in a major way. And I'd point to communist countries, left-wing, progressive, socialist, communist countries, which have enslaved their entire populations. The Nazis, another Nazi socialist entity, enslaved tens of thousands of people. That happened in recent times. That's a reversion to slavery, and it was one that was completely contrary to Judaic law, which, of course, was embraced by Christianity. So I think we have to look at that in context. It wasn't slavery like, with people being whipped in a field. I mean, that wasn't what was going on. It actually was a reform from that. That was the activity of the pagan nations around the Israelites who were worshiping idols. And by the way, idols represent the ultimate example of a man-made entity. Earthen, they took, earth and stone, and they created these things with fire in the belly so people could throw their babies in it. I mean, this was basically one of the thrusts of the Torah. One of the revelations at Sinai was that God was coming down and telling man to get rid of those practices, that those are made by pharaohs and by kings, and to see beyond that, to go to a higher level, to get rid of things like human sacrifice.
Well, excuse me. One of the things you said really stuck out to me. You said it's not like they were out whipping their slaves in the field. In the book of Exodus, I believe it's chapter 21. Don't count me on this. It's either 20 or 21. There's a verse that explains that if anyone beats their slave with a rod and the slave dies because they beat him so hard, then they have to punish the owner. But if they beat him and they're able to get back up and recover and not die, then we should not punish the slave owner. So, I mean, this is, I think, in the discussions I have, and we don't really touch on slavery in my movie. But
let me just respond to that. Again, that was a reform with regard to what was going on at that time. Don't forget, the Torah takes place in collectivist times. It was before man had developed a consciousness. People were beaten to death all the time. To say that this moved man away from those sorts of practices, it wasn't a situation where you could, murder, 1 million unborn babies or 1 million people in communist China. This was a move away from that practice and saying that it was forbidden to murder. So, again, this has to be viewed as as the movement, because this is what the condition was for the human society at that time. Unfortunately, it still is in some areas. It moved man away from those practices by stepping him on a road, toward reform, in a context that they could understand, given the brutal nature of those times. And it wasn't endorsing slavery. It simply was trying to regulate slavery as a move toward basically reducing it.
Right. So if we look at the full context, right, if God is giving laws to the people, right, and you're saying that we really need God's objective morality to be moral, because if we're atheists, then we don't have anybody to look to. If we're looking to God at that point in time, God said, listen, if you hit your slave and they die, we're going to punish you. But if they don't die, it's okay. That's what it says in Exodus.
No, that's not what this meant. It didn't say it's okay. It simply put in a regulation saying that you will be punished if you kill your slave, because back then people were killing slaves. It was a reform. It didn't say it was okay.
If you don't kill your slave, you won't be punished for beating them. Are you saying that's not sort of a brushing off?
No, first of all, the beating was not what you think of when you think of like the antebellum South. It was more like a kind of like the way somebody would slap their child, that kind of a thing.
With a rod, according to Exodus.
Yeah, with a rod like they might do in the old days in the elementary school, because you misbehaved. Now, again, I'm not endorsing that. By the way, I'm against that personally. But it was saying that you cannot, abuse a person. You can use, capital punishment if they're not capital punishment, but you can use physical punishment to deal with misbehavior. But it basically reformed it in that it said you can't, do something that would endanger their life. It was to be viewed as in the context of a reform for man, and it's one that we should look. Josh, I guess that what I would suggest is that the moral code that came out of the Torah, it takes a look at life as it is, and it begins to regulate things in such a way that man can move toward sovereignty, toward improvement. I mean, it was the Torah that put forth the rules of engagement when it came to war. It was the Torah that put forth in the Sinai the idea of creating a separate judiciary and a separate limited government. They created the concept of private ownership of property when Abraham bought a plot of land to bury his wife. It created a system of weights and measures where we can have honest money. It established business relationships, the proper means by which we should trade goods and services. It established personal relationships, sexual relationships, relationships between nations. In other words, the entire body, it's more than just the Ten Commandments. It is an entire blueprint for how one ought to order their life as imperfect beings, because we're all created in the image of God. We're not gods. And it also points the way forward in terms of how to advance, by helping your neighbor. I mean, the idea of love your neighbor as yourself, that's not something that exists in nature. That's something that is learned. I mean, it's an idea that, you develop from somewhere. I would say that whether you are a believer or not, the Western concepts as embodied in the United States come from the Torah, even if you think the Torah is man-made.
Yeah, well, excuse me again. When it comes to the Torah as the moral standard, I'm not saying there's not good stuff in there. And as you know, I was a former Pentecostal, and we talk about this in Losing God, my movie that's now on DVD. But morality is one of the big issues we talk about. So the statement I'm trying to make here is that I believe you said that we need to get our morals from God, right? And as a former Pentecostal, God speaks to us through His Word is how we interpret that, right? So if we're looking back to the Old Testament for our morals, that's great. There's plenty of good stuff we can get out of that. I'm with you on that. However, your claim is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, your claim is that we have based everything on an objective moral standpoint, And that's better than subjective. And my argument is it's not, because if we look toward the Old Testament, we see that there are some parts where it says very outright there's a punishment for doing something wrong, right? If a man has sex with his mother-in-law, they shall be burned at the stake. That's in Leviticus. Right. Yet in Exodus, if a man is going to hit his slave with a rod and the slave does not die, we won't punish him at all. My point is, subjectively, I'd say we need to punish somebody for beating another human being, regardless of what the standards are in place, that he's going to help me, mow my lawn or with my crops or whatever you want to, put the context. The context, in my mind, is subjectively we should say that's wrong because it's hurting another human being, regardless of what God tells us is okay.
Well, why do you think that first of all, why would you think it would be wrong? Where do you come up with that? And secondly, the idea of of retaliation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Again, this has to be viewed, and I'm speaking here more as a Jew. We're not fundamentalists. I mean, I would argue that while Christians mean well in that they're fundamentalists, they sometimes miss the point because, number one, the Torah can't be accurately translated unless you know it in Hebrew, and secondly, the Talmud basically takes Torah law and it applies it. It created a basis upon which we have a system of justice, a system of jurisprudence. But instead of, if you read the Talmud and you understand how that's applied, instead of literally taking an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and again, that's not what it says in Hebrew, it means that you're compensated. It means that there's a system by which justice is rendered, and the compensation is usually in the form of money. Or if it is a capital crime, it's in the form of an execution.
Chuck Morse speaks.
Thank you very much. My guest is Josh Preville. He's a filmmaker, author, mentalist. The website is joshpreville.com. Josh, I don't want to be misunderstood as criticizing fundamentalist Christianity, even though I may not subscribe to it, because I think that in practice, they're not taking an eye out for an eye. I mean, they do live within the system of jurisprudence that I would argue emanates from a more Judaic understanding of the Torah, which is the foundation of the American system as well. But even if one does say that, one looks at the text, the example is that, in a very visual way, that there needs to be justice for crime. There needs to be compensation when one commits a violation of someone else's rights. And, and by the way, I think that Islam is also, even though they accept the Torah, there needs to be some reform there as well in terms of understanding the greater nuance and realizing that you don't literally poke out someone's eyes. It's never been done. It's more a matter of finding a system of jurisprudence where there can be a penalty levied based upon the severity of the crime. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think we all, for the most part, agree within society there needs to be laws. My only point is that if we're looking to the, Judeo-Christian objective morality that they're asserting, because I don't necessarily believe that it is objective. I think that it's something that, it's tough when you use these terms because I think someone is asserting objectivity, right? They're saying, well, God made the rules. We need to follow God. But I think it was originally a subjective, standpoint. I think somebody had to write it down and come up with it, and then we all follow it. So, I mean, if we're claiming
that's reason, because Josh, you're not a believer. that's fine.
Right.
You're not a believer.
I would just look for evidence. That's the question. So, if we're looking to this asserted objective morality, you've made the claim, well, we got to get it there because if we don't follow it, we're going to go downhill. I'm saying if we're reading the Old Testament and we want to look to that, we can see that the context is some things, yes, very good. You should not kill people. Other things, not so good.
It comes from God. But since we're reaching toward the end of the program, I want to ask you, I'll change the subject a little bit here. And sure. I noticed that on your website, you're into mentalism. You do mentalist performance. What is that? What is mentalism?
Well, there's a lot of, sort of like the word atheist. You take a word and people have their own meanings. But I think for the most part, the agreement on what mentalism is, it's a performance art in which you take the classic magic tricks, right, which are sort of, sometimes can be corny, but sometimes can be pretty impressive, and you add in an extra level of psychology to it. And me personally, I take in a lot of pseudoscience, so it becomes more of taking on, let's say, psychics. I don't believe in psychics, and the tagline is, I take what they do and I try to do it better. So there's a technique called cold reading, in which I'd say most performers, not all, but most performers who do cold reading would argue that's what psychics are doing. They're giving the illusion that they can commune with the dead. So let's say an example of one of the things that would happen in a mentalist performance is I would do a performance of cold reading. So I would explain how the psychics work as I'm putting on a psychic feat, basically, showing how a psychic medium would be deceiving the audience. So at the same time, you're getting a performance that you're enjoying, but you're learning something from it, and you're taking something away in the end. So it's basically, it's like magic, but you add in mind reading and that type of stuff, which my argument is there's no such thing as mind reading either. But you give that illusion of things related to the mind more so than somebody who does, shows you effects with cards or a big stage act would do. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, it sounds like it's the use of illusion and distraction. I mean, it's not, since you're not involved with mind reading, and I don't know if there's such a thing either. But I mean, I think it does. I mean, what exactly does this performance look like? I mean, what are you doing when you're performing?
Sure. Well, I usually cater it. It depends on what I'm doing. If it's more of like a corporate event or a sort of just a local thing, but. There's a few things I'll do. There's a performance all about psychics in general. So there's a lot of different types of psychics out there. There's people who believe in PK, where you can move things with your mind. There's people who believe that you can, it's something called remote viewing, where you can see things. A lot of times they believe that the government hired psychics to do remote viewing during the Cold War. So remote viewing is when you can see something somewhere else and not be there. So see, for example, if I could see what was going on in your studio right now, okay? So one of the main things I do is we go through all the different types of psychic categorizations, basically, communing with the dead, tarot cards, all that type of stuff that I don't believe is mystical at all. I believe it's all based in the psychological techniques, in biological techniques, and in trickery, in illusion. So I'll go through, and it will be a performance in which you can see these feats, and we actually expose some of them for the audience. So it really depends on what you're going there for to see. But for the main part, lately, I'd say in the last 2 or 3 years, I've been really taking on psychics, and we actually have a project coming out maybe within a year or two that's going to actually deal with psychic powers and put it basically in a sort of a mainstream viewpoint in another type of film project that we're going to be doing. But, yeah, for the most part, lately, in the last few years, I've been dealing mostly with psychic abilities. You do demonstrations that if you came in believing I'm a psychic, you would walk away convinced. But we'll actually say, listen, this is not psychic, and some of it we actually expose.
Right. I mean, this is an area where I have a feeling I would mostly agree with you on.
Yeah.
I don't know a lot about it. I understand that there have been some people who have worked, for example, with police departments who have certain intuitive ability to help them solve crimes. There's been some murders that have been allegedly solved that way. But I really don't know a lot about it. I'm very skeptical on it, actually.
And that's
the
good.
whole
We try to
ESP
encourage
thing.
skepticism in everything.
Yeah,
and like you said with the police force, a lot of those things we try to work on and talk about as well.